In my world, a lockdown usually means a war is starting or the police are at the gates. But tonight, I shut down the most secure estate in Seoul for a reason that would get me killed by my own board, a 7-year-old girl hiding in my kitchen cabinet. My name is Subin, and until 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, I was the most calculated man in the Korean underworld. I dealt in tactical advantages, cold steel, and absolute silence. In my world, a lockdown usually means a war is starting or the police are at the gates. But tonight, I shut down the most secure estate in Seoul for a reason that would get me killed by my own board, a 7-year-old girl hiding in my kitchen cabinet. My name is Subin, and until 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, I was the most calculated man in the Korean underworld. I dealt in tactical advantages, cold steel, and absolute silence. The silence of the estate was usually a point of pride, but tonight it felt heavy thick with the scent of ozone and incoming rain. I moved through the shadows of the West Wing, the beam of my tactical light slicing through the darkness like a surgeon's blade. My earpiece crackled with the rhythmic reports of my security team. Sector 4 clear, perimeter secure. I didn't believe them. I had a sixth sense for anomalies, a phantom itch on the scar that ran down my right cheek, earned from a decade of looking for things people didn't want me to find. When I reached the kitchen, the air felt different. The industrial refrigerator hummed a low, steady drone, but beneath it was a sound that didn't belong in a house of stone and silence. The ragged, shallow hitch of a breath. I dropped low, my dress shoes silent on the cold marble as I pivoted toward the center island. My flashlight moved with lethal precision, illuminating the silver handles of the lower cabinets. One was a fraction of an inch ajar. I didn't draw my weapon, not yet, but my hand hovered near my holster. With a sharp, practiced motion, I swung the cabinet door open. The light hit her first, wide, amber-brown eyes that reflected the beam like a startled fawn's. She was tucked into the corner, knees pulled to her chest, a dark gray hoodie swallowed by the shadows of the cabinetry. She was small, too small to be a threat, but the way she held a camouflage backpack against her heart told me she was carrying something heavy enough to kill for. I felt my brows furrow, my mind racing through a list of enemies, searching for a face that matched hers. I found nothing. I leaned forward, the light catching the sharp lines of my suit as I prepared to demand who had sent her. Before I could speak, she moved. Her hand came up, trembling but deliberate, and she pressed a single, small finger against her lips. Shh. The gesture was a physical blow. In this house, I was the one who gave orders. I was the one who dictated who lived, who died, and who stayed silent. Yet, looking at the sheer terror masked by her desperate bravery, the air left my lungs. She wasn't just hiding, she was waiting for a monster she thought was right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder at the empty, darkened kitchen, then back at her. She didn't know that I was the most dangerous thing in this building. Or maybe she did, and she was betting everything on the hope that I was the lesser of two evils. I reached for the radio at my hip, my gaze never leaving her wide, alert eyes. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. I could call the sweep, I could have her removed. But as she curled tighter into the dark, a cold, unfamiliar fire ignited in my chest, level black. I whispered into the comms, my voice like grinding stone, full lockdown, now. The moment the command left my lips, the house groaned in response. It started with the high-pitched whine of hydraulics, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of reinforced steel shutters slamming shut over every window and exit. In the command center, monitors would be flashing crimson, and my security teams would be scrambling into their tactical gear, expecting an assassination attempt or a full-scale invasion. They weren't prepared for the reality. I lowered my flashlight, the harsh glare softening as I bounced the light off the marble floor to keep from blinding the girl. Chinasa didn't move. She watched me with the stillness of someone who had learned that even breathing could be a betrayal. I stood up slowly, my joints stiff, and adjusted the cuff of my jacket. I was a man of protocols, and I had just broken every single one for a child whose name I didn't even know. My earpiece exploded with the voice of Minho, my head of security, and a man I'd trusted for a decade. Sir, level black is engaged. We've established a 3-tier perimeter, but we don't have a visual on the threat. What are we looking for? I looked down at the cabinet. Chinasa was still clutching that camouflage backpack, her knuckles a pale contrast against her deep brown skin. The threat is external. I lied, my voice smooth and devoid of the sudden tension in my gut. Maintain the lockdown. No one enters, and more importantly, no one leaves. Bring the kitchen staff to the service entrance. I need food prepared. There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. Food, sir? We're in a tactical blackout. Should I order the chefs to secure the larder for a siege? No, I said, catching a glimpse of the girl's eyes darting toward the pantry. She looked small, hungry. Tell them to make chicken nuggets and something with fruit. High quality, and do it fast. Silence greeted me. I could almost feel Minho's confusion through the radio, the cognitive dissonance of a man who expected to be ordering a counterstrike, but was instead being sent on a fast food mission. Sir? I'm not sure I heard you correctly. Chicken nuggets? You heard me, Minho. Do it now, or I'll find someone who can follow a simple order. I cut the comms before he could respond. Turning back to the cabinet, I crouched again, making sure my movements were visible and non-threatening. I reached out a hand, not to grab her, but to offer a way out of the dark. The shutters are down, I told her, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly hum. Nothing is getting in here, not tonight. She looked at my hand, then up at the scar on my cheek. She didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly lowered the finger from her lips and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a lifetime. Chinasa finally emerged from the cabinet, moving with a cautious, bird-like fragility that made the vastness of the kitchen feel suddenly cavernous. She didn't let go of the backpack. Even as a tray of food was placed on the island by a trembling chef who dared not look up, her eyes remained fixed on the camouflage fabric. I dismissed the staff with a sharp flick of my wrist, waiting until the heavy service doors hissed shut before I turned my attention back to her. The bag, I said, my voice modulated to be firm but not harsh. Whatever is in there is the reason you're running. If I'm going to protect you, I need to know what I'm up against. She hesitated, her small fingers digging into the straps. I didn't reach for it. I simply waited, leaning against the cold granite, letting the silence of the locked-down mansion act as a shield. Slowly, she unzipped the main compartment. She didn't pull out a toy or a blanket. Instead, she reached deep into the lining and produced a rugged, military-grade encrypted drive and a tattered ledger filled with names I recognized all too well, names of men who sat on my board, and names of politicians who owed me favors. I straightened, the air in the room suddenly turning frigid. I took the ledger from her small, steady hand. As I flipped through the pages, I saw the meticulous handwriting of a man who had been documenting the Iron Circle's darkest transactions for years. This wasn't just a child. She was the living evidence of a conspiracy that could dismantle the entire infrastructure of the city's underworld. My rivals hadn't just murdered her parents for a whistle-blown secret, they were hunting her because she was the only one who could unlock the encryption on that drive. She wasn't a stray who had wandered into my home by accident. She had been sent, or perhaps she had chosen me, because she knew that only a monster could keep other monsters at bay. They killed them, she whispered, her first words cracking the silence. Her voice was small, but it carried a weight that made my scar itch with a phantom burn. They said if I took the bag, the shadows wouldn't find me. I looked from the ledger to the girl who sat quietly before a plate of untouched food. The Iron Circle wouldn't stop at my gates. They would throw everything they had at these walls, not for the money or the power, but for the girl who held the key to their extinction. I reached for my comms, my thumb clicking the transmitter with a finality that felt like a death warrant. Minho, triple the ammunition at every entry point. Tell the men to prepare for a siege. And Minho? Yes, sir? If anyone asks why we aren't handing over the asset, tell them the asset has a name, and she's officially a Kong. I looked at Chinasa, who was finally taking a small, tentative bite of the food. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer a tactical inconvenience, it was a war for the future of a child who had nowhere else to go. The low hum of the mansion's emergency power was the only thing filling the space between us, a rhythmic vibration that felt like the house itself was breathing. I sat in the armchair opposite the sofa where Chinasa had curled up, the heavy ledger resting on my lap like a lead weight. The lockdown had turned the estate into a tomb of glass and steel, isolating us from a world that was currently screaming for her blood. I watched her through the dim, amber glow of the recessed lighting. She was small, nearly swallowed by the oversized hoodie, but her gaze was unsettlingly focused. Most men twice my size and forged in the same fires I was, couldn't look me in the eye for more than a few seconds. They saw the suit, the title, and the jagged, diagonal scar that marked my face, and they saw their own ends. Chinasa didn't look away. She sat with her knees tucked under her chin, her eyes tracing the line of the scar from my temple down to my jaw. I felt the familiar urge to turn my head, to hide the deformity that served as a permanent map of my most violent failure. I had spent a lifetime using that mark to terrify people, but under her scrutiny, it felt less like a weapon and more like a wound. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice a mere silver thread in the silence. "Not anymore," I replied, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears, softer, stripped of the jagged edge I used on my subordinates. "It's just a reminder to keep my guard up." She nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense. She reached out a hand, hovering it inches from her own smooth, dark cheek, mimicking the path of the mark on mine. "My daddy said scars are just stories that the skin forgot how to tell." A sharp, unexpected pang tightened my chest. I wasn't a father. I wasn't even a particularly good man. But in that moment, looking at the child who had lost everything yet still found the courage to be curious about my pain, the wall I'd built around my heart developed a hairline fracture. We fell back into silence, but it was no longer the jagged, defensive quiet of a predator and its prey. It was the silence of two survivors in a bunker. I realized then that she wasn't afraid of me because she recognized the same shadow in my eyes that had been chasing her across the city. We were both marked by a world that didn't know how to be gentle. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a brief second, allowing the level black security to do its job. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the board, the territory, or the next move. I was just there, anchored in the stillness, by a girl who looked at a monster and saw a story. The stillness was severed not by a sound, but by a shift in the air, a faint, metallic scrape vibrating through the ceiling's ventilation duct. I was on my feet before the second vibration could travel down the wall. The transition from a companion to a predator was instantaneous, my muscles coiling with a cold, familiar precision. I looked at Chinasa. She had sensed it too. Her small body was rigid, her eyes darting toward the dark ceiling. I didn't want the last thing she saw tonight to be the reason I had earned my throne. "Chinasa," I said, my voice a low, commanding anchor. "Go back into the kitchen, sit under the table and close your eyes. Do not open them until you hear only my voice. Do you understand?" She didn't argue. She saw the shift in my expression, the deadness that settled behind my eyes, and scrambled toward the kitchen. As the door swung shut behind her, the vent cover above the hallway groaned. I didn't reach for the radio. I reached for the suppressed pistol at my small of my back, my thumb clicking the safety off with a sound no louder than a heartbeat. The first assassin dropped from the duct with the grace of a shadow, clad in matte black tactical gear. He didn't even have time to level his weapon before I fired. Two muffled thuds, center mass and head, and he was a heap of useless fabric on the marble. The second followed, his boots hitting the floor just as I cleared the distance between us. I didn't waste another bullet. I drove the heel of my palm into his throat, feeling the cartilage give way, and used his falling body as a shield when a third man appeared in the vent. I fired upward. 3 rounds. A choked cry followed, and blood began to drip through the slats of the metal grate, staining the white ceiling crimson. The silence returned, but it was now tainted with the copper tang of fresh death. I stood over the bodies, my breathing as steady as if I'd been reading the ledger, but my heart was a drum of ice. They were Iron Circle, highly trained, desperate, and already inside my skin. I wiped a stray drop of blood from the cuff of my white dress shirt, the silk stained forever. I didn't call the cleanup crew. Not yet. I moved to the kitchen door and pushed it open. Chinasa was exactly where I had told her to be, her hands pressed tightly over her eyes, her small frame trembling. The sight of her vulnerability in the wake of such clinical violence felt like a cold blade to my ribs. You can open them now, I said. My voice was steady, but I stayed in the doorway, keeping the shadows of the hallway and the bodies within them hidden behind my back. She looked up, her eyes searching mine for the monster she had just heard. I didn't let her see him. I just held out my hand. The bodies had been dragged away, but the lingering scent of iron and gunpowder refused to leave the corridor. I stood in the center of the command room, the blue light of a dozen monitors reflecting off my face, turning my scar into a jagged shadow. Behind me, the door hissed open. I didn't need to turn to know it was Minho. His footfalls were heavy, lacking their usual rhythmic discipline. The perimeter is reinforced and the vents are welded shut, Minho reported, his voice tight. He walked around the table until he was standing in my peripheral vision. He wasn't looking at the screens, he was looking at me. But we have a problem, Subin. The men are talking. Let them talk, I said, my eyes tracking a heat signature on the north fence. As long as they keep their triggers warm, I don't care what's on their tongues. They're asking why we're under siege for a girl who isn't ours, Minho snapped, his composure finally fracturing. The Iron Circle has reached out. They're offering a ceasefire and a massive payout if we just leave the kitchen door unlocked. They don't want a war with us. They just want the bag. I turned slowly. The silence that followed was a physical weight, the kind that usually preceded a funeral. Minho had been my right hand since we were boys in the slums, but tonight he looked like a stranger. He looked like a businessman weighing a loss. Are you suggesting we negotiate? I asked softly. I'm suggesting we survive. Minho stepped closer, his hands splayed on the glass table. You've put the entire syndicate on the line for a stray. One girl, Subin. She's nothing to us. She's not blood, she's not business. If you keep this up, the board will call for a vote of no confidence before the sun comes up. They think you've lost your mind. I stepped into his space, my shadow falling over him. I reached out and adjusted the lapel of his tactical vest, a gesture that looked casual but felt like a noose. She is not a stray, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating hum. And she is no longer nothing. The moment I engaged level black, she became part of this house. If we hand her over to save our skin, then our name means nothing. Our word means nothing. And I would rather rule a graveyard than a syndicate of cowards. I leaned in closer until my scar was inches from his eyes. Tell the men and tell the board. Chinasa is a Kong now. Anyone who has a problem with that can settle it with me once the gates are clear. But if I hear the word negotiate again, I'll start the cleansing with you. Minho's throat bobbed. The defiance in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a cold, resigned fear. He bowed his head, a sharp, jerky motion. Understood, sir. He turned and left, the heavy doors sealing behind him. I looked back at the monitor. In the corner of the screen, a small camera feed from the library showed Chinasa asleep on the rug, her fingers still curled around the strap of her backpack. She was a Kong. And I was about to show the world exactly what that meant. The first explosion didn't just shake the mansion, it rattled the very foundations of the earth beneath it. A massive tactical strike, coordinated and brutal, slammed into the north gate, the shockwave shattering the reinforced glass of the upper balconies. Then came the silence, a terrifying absolute void as the primary power grid failed. The blue glow of the monitors died, the hum of the ventilation ceased, and the estate was plunged into a suffocating, ink-black darkness. I didn't need sight. I had memorized every inch of this fortress. I moved through the library with the predatory grace of a ghost, my hand finding the heavy mahogany door just as the emergency red lights flickered to life, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. Chinasa, I called out. I found her pressed against the bookshelf, her camouflage backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't scream. She had learned early that noise was a beacon for death. I scooped her up in one arm, her weight almost nothing against my chest, and felt her small hands lock into the fabric of my suit jacket. Stay small, I whispered into her hair, the scent of lavender soap, a jarring contrast to the rising smell of smoke. Outside, the rhythmic thunder of automatic fire began to chew through the walls. The Iron Circle wasn't lurking in the vents anymore. They were coming through the front door with heavy ordnance. My earpiece was a chaotic mess of static and screaming. "They've breached the foyer! We're losing the South Hall!" I ignored the comms. My priority had narrowed to the 3 square feet of space surrounding the girl. I retreated into the service corridors, the narrow arteries of the house where the shadows were deepest. Every few seconds, the mansion groaned as another thermal charge detonated against the exterior. I felt Chinasa's heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, fluttering thing. I tucked her head under my chin, shielding her from the dust shaking loose from the ceiling. "I've got you," I murmured, more a vow than a comfort. In the flickering red light, I saw the first of them 3 silhouettes moving through the dining room, their night vision goggles glowing like demonic eyes. I didn't slow down. I drew my sidearm, the cold weight of the metal, a familiar extension of my will. I fired 3 times into the dark, the suppressed shots sounding like coughs in the roar of the siege. The silhouettes dropped, but I knew there were dozens more behind them. The power was out, my men were falling, and the most secure building in Seoul was being dismantled piece by piece. But as Chinasa squeezed my hand, I realized the Iron Circle had made a fatal mistake. They thought they were breaking into a house to steal a drive. They didn't realize they were breaking into a cage with a man who finally had something to lose. The shadows in the kitchen were long and jagged, cast by the flickering emergency lights that pulsed like a dying heart. This was where it had started a small girl in a cabinet, a shush and a choice. Now it would end here. I set Chinasa down behind the heavy industrial prep station, the cold stainless steel, a temporary barricade against the chaos. "Stay low," I commanded, my voice a rasping whisper. "Don't move until the air is still." She nodded, her eyes wide but filled with a terrifyingly adult understanding. I turned back toward the service entrance just as the doors were kicked off their hinges. 3 men swept in, their silhouettes framed by the fire and smoke of the hallway behind them. They moved like professionals, weapons raised, scanning the dark for the prize they had been promised. But they weren't hunting a businessman anymore. They were hunting a ghost. I moved before the first man could center his gaze. I didn't fire. I closed the distance with a speed born of pure, cold adrenaline. I caught his wrist, snapping the bone with a sickening crack, and drove my combat knife upward, under the jawline. He went down without a sound. The second man turned, but I was already a blur in his peripheral vision. I spun, sweeping his legs out from under him, and finished the work with a single, clinical shot from my suppressed pistol. The third man, the leader, a scarred veteran of the Iron Circle, dived behind the central island. We stayed there for a heartbeat, separated only by 6 feet of granite and the terrified breathing of a child. "Give us the girl, Subin." He spat, his voice echoing off the tile. "You're burning your whole world for a ghost. Is she worth the Kong name?" I didn't answer with words. I kicked a heavy metal pot across the floor, the clatter drawing his fire for a fraction of a second. It was all the window I needed. I lunged over the island, my weight slamming into him like a falling mountain. We hit the floor, a tangle of limbs and steel. He went for his knife, but my hand was already at his throat. The scar on my cheek burned, a hot line of fire as I leaned in close, staring into his eyes. "She isn't just a name," I growled, the words vibrating with a lethal, paternal fury. "She's mine." I didn't blink as I pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was deafening. The roar of the siege outside had faded into the distance, my men finally reclaiming the perimeter. But inside the kitchen, time stood still. I stood up, my suit ruined, blood staining my white shirt, and looked toward the prep station. Chinasa emerged from the shadows, her camouflage backpack still clutched to her chest. She looked at the bodies, then up at me. She didn't look away from the blood or the monster I had become to save her. She walked over and reached out, her small hand gripping my sleeve. The threat was gone. The Iron Circle was broken. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for the next move. I was just looking at her. The sun rose over Seoul not as a herald of peace, but as a witness to a new kind of order. In the months following the siege, the Iron Circle didn't just vanish. I dismantled them until their very name was a footnote in the city's ledger. My board of directors no longer whispered about my sanity. They had seen the lengths I would go to for what was mine, and they had learned that a man with something to protect is infinitely more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose. I stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, checking the time on my watch. It was 7:45 a.m. The mansion was no longer a tomb of glass and steel. It was a home. The heavy steel shutters had been replaced with reinforced ballistic glass that allowed the light in, though the level black protocols remained a single keystroke away. "Chinasa, we're going to be late," I called out. My voice, once used only to dictate death warrants, now carried the impatient, protective lilt of a guardian. The rhythmic thud of small feet echoed from the landing. Chinasa descended the stairs, no longer wearing the oversized, dusty gray hoodie. She wore a crisp school uniform, her hair neatly braided, and a brand new backpack. This one, a bright, defiant yellow, slung over her shoulders. She still carried the old camouflage bag inside the new one, a secret relic of the night we met, but her eyes no longer searched the shadows for monsters. She knew I had already fed them to the dark. I reached out, smoothing the collar of her jacket. She looked up at me, her gaze lingering on the scar on my cheek. She didn't say anything, but she reached up and gave a small, quick pat to the mark, a silent ritual of affection that had become our morning tradition. "Ready?" I asked. "Ready, Subin?" she chirped, her voice clear and bright. We walked toward the front entrance, the heavy doors swinging open to reveal the motorcade waiting in the drive. 12 men in sharp black suits, the uncles, as she called them, straightened as we approached. They were the deadliest men in my organization, forged in the same fire that had nearly consumed the estate. And today, their mission was the most critical of their careers, a school run. Minho stood by the lead SUV, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses, though he held the door open with a deference that went beyond rank. He had been the first to realize that my insanity was actually the only thing that had saved us. We weren't just a syndicate anymore, we were a family with a future. I took Chinasa's hand, her small fingers disappearing into my palm. As we walked toward the car, surrounded by a wall of suits and the silent promise of absolute protection, I realized that my legacy wasn't the blood I'd spilled or the territory I'd won. It was the girl walking beside me, unafraid of the world because she knew the king of the underworld was walking her to class. The lockdown was over, but the guard would never drop. This was the life we had built from the ruins, a life where the shadows served the light.